Is this good? Yeah, so I think I have to hit continue. Welcome everybody to another space dialogue. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Laura Grego, a senior scientist at the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Just a little word about what the UCS does. I think this was founded in 1969 at MIT, but it is a science-based advocacy organization. And from a teaching and research perspective, I would say it's also an extraordinarily trustworthy source for information on the satellite database, something that we all use in our research and teaching. Now, Laura is with us today because she's one of the world's leading authorities on technical analysis and advocacy related with technology and security in outer space. Before joining UCS, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. She earned a PhD in experimental physics at Caltech and a BS in physics and astronomy at the University of Michigan. I just heard that she is also going to MIT in the fall to be a Stimson Nuclear Fellow. I do want to mention two things. One is that she has written numerous papers, but she is also a very trusted source and has testified in national and international bodies. And she has testified before Congress and also addressed the UN General Assembly and the UN Conference on Disarmament on Space Security Issues. And this gives a great segue for the talk that she is here today for, the case for space arms control. So over to you, Laura, for remarks on that subject, and then we'll come back to some questions. Welcome to UW and welcome to UW Spark Dialogues.
Thank you, Sadie, for the very kind introduction. Thanks all of you for joining. Looks like a good crew. I am, as Sadie mentioned, technical by background, but I'm used to talking to lawyers and policy people. So the talk I have is sort of a mix of both. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff all of you will already know and maybe some stuff that you don't. But I hope it'll be enough to set a conversation with you about space arms control. And I hope to persuade you by the end that it's necessary and possible. So I'm going to use slides because sometimes it's nice to look at pictures and helps us keep together. So here we go. Share and if I can get a verbal note that you all see, you can see this.
Yep.
Yeah, and hear me.
Good.
Sounds good. Okay. So well, most of you may know, but March 27, 2019, India launched a missile defense interceptor into space and intentionally obliterated one of its low Earth orbiting satellites with the force of impact. And Prime Minister Modi at the time declared that Mission Shakti had put India in an elite group of space powers. And that was alluding to the fact that India was indeed the only fourth country to destroy its own satellite intentionally after Russia, the US, and China. So while that satellite had been destroyed at a low enough altitude to ensure that atmospheric drag would clear out most of the detritus out of orbit within weeks or days, some debris was thrown up at much higher altitudes, and that was expected to stay in orbit for months or years, where it could collide with other satellites. So this exercise, Mission Shakti, was a manifestation, visible to those of us who are watching the sky, of a dangerous arms race dynamic that's been unfolding rather slowly. So sometimes call it an arms amble rather than a race, but it's certainly going in one direction for decades. But it's been recently picking up some speed. The ability to hold satellites at risk is becoming more sophisticated, and it's proliferating both on the ground and in orbit into different countries. In the last couple of years, Russia's been conducting tests of a system reported to be its own ground-based anti-satellite direct descent weapon, like the kind India launched, though those tests didn't actually destroy a satellite. And the US has decried maneuvers by Russia around sensitive US satellites. France, having been frustrated by a loitering Russian satellite around its own national security satellite, unveiled a new military space strategy and announced the right to an active defense of its satellites. The US's defense budget included plans to build space missile defense interceptors and directed energy weapons, though those were eventually stripped from the budget by Congress. And upon the December 20th, 2019 presidential signing of that defense budget, the US established the Space Force as a separate military branch, giving responsibility for preparing for the US to establish superiority, that's a quote, in space and to perform offensive and defensive space control. So this is all unfolding against a backdrop with very little diplomatic energy spent to constrain this dynamic. In fact, a few days after India's test, a 2-year United Nations process to examine practical measures to prevent an arms race in outer space ended in failure to reach consensus on recommendations. And there are a few other alternative processes, such as the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, because that has been in deadlock for decades. But we, have some hopes that that may be softening. But absent any energy or any correction, the space strategic environment will become more threatening and unpredictable as countries build these technologies and don't have methods in order to communicate correctly intent and don't have a lot of agreed upon norms and rules. Also, the space physical environment for all users might degrade because of fast-moving debris from anti-satellite tests, even if they're done with nominal care to produce the smallest amount of debris possible. States will spend more resources preparing for conflict and crises, and since commercial and other civil operators operate in the same physical space as national security users, they'll have to have a plan for a more unpredictable and dangerous environment as well. And this uncertainty will not be constrained to space. Space activities in the national security arena risk sparking or exacerbating terrestrial crises in ways that might be hard to manage or hard to predict. So what can be done? Is arms control for space necessary? Is it achievable? I'm going to start back. I'm going to rewind us in time a little bit to about 20 years ago. You're reading a quotation from the Air Force Space Command spokesman likening space to the ultimate high ground. And so this is sort of a thread of the way of looking at space, which I think has dominated thinking for a long time, which is actually, technically not really accurate. And using this as a metaphor has led us down some pathways which I think are not particularly fruitful. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about why space is the high ground and space superiority is a lens that gets in our own way. So back 20 years ago, the political conditions were right for longtime space weapons enthusiasts to set the stage for a cherished dream, domination and control of space for military purposes. And this high ground became the governing principle. And you do see this language happen over and over again. Although things have become more nuanced, there's still a significant strain. So back then, actually, one of the things we did in my organization was we realized that physics sets important limits on what can and can't be done in space. And as policy advocates, we saw that the policy debate would benefit from being technically informed. So I'd be happy to send this. It's pretty old, but it's still pretty useful. We have plenty of copies. You can get them online. It's been translated into Mandarin, but we've shopped this around for quite a while. But it lays out the basic physics. So how is physics going to help us understand whether the idea of a high ground makes sense? Well, you kind of have to know what the reason for calling something high ground is. And one of them is that it provides a vantage point to see an enemy coming. You can see much further from a hill, right? This is an ancient fort, I think, in India. And only one force can occupy that vantage point. It also may allow you to conceal yourself from your enemy's view. You can see your enemy, but your enemy might not be able to see you. But of course, those of us who are technical, most of us on this call probably know this, that the space high ground in this sense, though, is widely available. Currently from our UCS satellite database that Sadia mentioned, we count 926 Earth-observing satellites in orbit as of January 1st of this year, out of around 3,400. Not all of those 3,400 satellites are military satellites, by the way. The vast majority are used for navigation, communication, science, and commerce, et cetera. So lots of people have this high ground vantage point. It isn't exclusive to somebody occupying that place. So in fact, so when you think about, well, the military isn't a particularly large part of the fleet of those 3,400 satellites. It's maybe 15%. conversely, space is critically important to militaries, especially those like the United States that wants to maintain a global footprint. So the military uses satellites for many things. I'm sure most of you know this: secure global communication, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, weather prediction, precision, timing and navigation. So, but the point here is that while satellites are peerless at providing this vantage point, there isn't just room for one person to occupy it. So in that sense, space is a high ground, but not unique. The other thing about high ground is that this metaphor that this high ground allows you to conceal yourself from the enemy, that doesn't apply to space, of course. It doesn't allow you to conceal your own assets from view. These are, I just really like the way these look. This is a Russian optical ground-based observation called Okno. They're just funny looking, but basically from, satellites are readily calculated. That is high school or, undergrad physics, pretty straightforward to know where they're going to be pretty much in the future. They're readily observed from the ground by radars and large optical telescopes. And as it turns out, even hobbyists in their backyards with binoculars are able to track satellites very well. So as a consequence, satellites are knowable. They can be, vulnerable. So despite being up there, they're sort of more like sitting ducks than a fortified castle. Another reason the high ground is described as militarily desirable is the idea that it provides a vantage point from which you can just drop a bomb from on high and gravity will assist you, and that it's difficult to defend against this rapidly moving ordnance. And this idea is one driver behind the desire for air superiority, but it doesn't really work the same for space. Objects don't drop from space. That once you're in orbit at these incredibly high speeds that are characteristic of orbit, 7 kilometers a second, sort of 30 times the speed of a jet, you have to expend a similar amount of energy to get them back down quickly. Also, because they're in space, they're moving quickly, and this is a picture of a sort of a constellation of GPS navigation satellites, but of course it illustrates the fact that satellites are always in motion with respect to the Earth. So they're generally not in one specific position that you want them to be at any given time. So you can't say hover over North Korea and drop a bomb over North Korea. It doesn't work that way. So this absenteeism issue, that they're not in one place at one time, is a critical flaw in these plans to put weapons in space that need to have a rapid response, such as space-based ballistic missile defenses, which are meant to target nuclear weapon carrying ballistic missiles as they're launched. Because ballistic missiles, space launch, they take 3 to 5 minutes. So you'd have to have something in the right place at that very time. So space is not sort of a similar to air superiority. And of course, as I mentioned, they don't drop from space. It takes enormous amounts of energy. This is an Atlas V rocket. Only a few % of the mass of what you're seeing is dedicated to the actual satellite. It takes 45 tons of fuel to put a 1-ton satellite into orbit, right? And most of that fuel is used to get the satellite up to the enormous lateral speed necessary to stay in there. So a weapon just doesn't drop back to Earth when you say go. It takes, energy to slow it back down. So if you're imagining that you wanted to have some great weapon, it's just very unlikely that you'd spend the energy to put it up in space only to just bring it back down again. It's one of the most costly ways to do that. They're just, while weapons, aiming at the Earth from space is, of course, one of the most provocative and attention-getting types of technologies people think about when they're worried about space weapons. They're one of the most unlikely, just because they're so costly and they're vulnerable. So the idea never quite goes away, and it haunts all of these efforts to try to create arms control. But in reality, they're not really the viable weapons, and I would argue should be able to be taken off the table. Also, the fact that once an object is put up in space, of course, a consequence of that it doesn't come down is that we have space debris. And this is, an illustration of the growth of space debris over time. Those dots are not to scale, but they'll have the speeds characteristic of orbit, which is very rapid. So something even the size of a marble could create a catastrophic collision with another satellite. And destructive satellite weapons can leave an enormous amount of debris in space that'll be dangerous and make it more risky to other space users. This is actually a fairly slightly dated graph of the growth of debris of different kinds of, from different sources over time, but you'll see the debris from the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test in black. You'll see that big bump around 2007 bumped up. Actually, it's in pink, but that it's responsible for that. And you can see sort of a lot of this energy that people have been sort of carefully doing responsible on-orbit, space debris mitigation. That progress can get wiped out by a single careless act and dump a whole bunch of debris back in there. So you'll see that even though it was sort of leveling off, we bumped up again. So while space debris has historically come from the detritus of launch and operation, we can wipe that out. So that was the single event that generated the most debris. I think there were an estimated 300,000 pieces of debris larger than 1 centimeter, which is that size that's about large enough to cause damage in a collision. The problem is, only around 3,300 of those were large enough to be tracked. So that's a lot of pieces of debris that can be dangerous, but are too small to be reliably tracked and avoided. So, that was the Fengyang 1C was a modestly sized satellite, but if one of these really big satellites were targeted or destroyed, you could easily sort of dump an enormous, amount more debris, double or triple the amount of large debris in LEO. And those tend to be just in the same orbits that we use for other things. So you would be putting a lot of dangerous debris right where you would want to be using other satellites. A conflict that led to multiple large satellites being destroyed would have catastrophic effects on the ability to use space safely. So while states that have investments and aspirations in space will tend to be self-deterred from using these kinds of weapons, the accumulation of this capability and the proliferation, because as I said, states are beginning to invest in this and test this, it leaves the possibility of their use open. And when one country's developing it, others don't want to be left behind. So, and these weapons, especially compared to other sort of anti-satellite techniques, these weapons are easy to see that they succeeded. You've destroyed something; it's no longer there. That has these advantages. I think countries still don't necessarily always want to give up. So this is probably the most technical slide I'll show. And what I want to take away from this is that missile defenses are sort of a confounding issue with space security, because missile defense interceptors of the type that the United States fields, China has been developing, and Russia has been developing are these sort of missile-based direct descent kinetic kill interceptors. So there's something that launches and runs itself into a launching missile or into the warhead as it travels through space. So these are systems that are designed to launch, with a few minutes warning and target a several hundred kilogram object traveling through space, about the same parts of space that low Earth orbit satellites go through. So something that's an intercontinental range ballistic missile will peak at about 1,000 kilometers altitude. So these are they're designed to operate in the same part of space. And the more powerful the missile defense interceptors, the higher, the more of low Earth orbit it could potentially target satellites in. So basically, the existence of missile defense interceptors provides sort of an existing technical capability to target satellites. And there's really not a way out of that except to scale back those missile defense capabilities, which would scale back ASAT capabilities. So that's sort of a confounding political issue, because of course missile defenses are very political. The other technology that is challenging for a different reason are closely approaching satellites on orbit, proximity operations, but basically the satellites that can approach another satellite without its cooperation or assistance so that they can get up close. That's a relatively new technology, relatively sophisticated, as being, more countries are learning how to do it in low Earth orbit and further orbits. It gets more sophisticated as you do that. Of course, getting up close to an object which isn't helping you allows you to inspect, refuel, repair, build large structures on orbit. Of course, so there's lots of beneficial uses of this technology. But on the other hand, getting up close to a satellite without its cooperation allows you to more easily disrupt it or attack it. You can spray its sensors with foam, you can set it spinning, you could interrupt with electronic warfare, you could bump it, you could all sorts of things. It makes it easier to do that without necessarily creating the debris that I mentioned, which is so problematic. So this close approach technology is very much dual use. So ideas of restricting the technology are likely to be unsuccessful because they have beneficial ways to do that. So there needs to be another way to go about that. This is just a little GIF or GIF that we created, and I'll just keep playing while I talk, give you the last bit of my remarks, which just shows over the last years how far space capability and space investment has grown over the world. Countries with satellites and countries that can launch, have increased over the years. So this is a problem that the whole world faces. The whole world has an investment, and that's the reason I'm showing you this. And good arms control provides benefits to its adherents, and it will, limits the advantage accrued to cheaters and is verifiable. So those are some of the goals you have: sensible constraints on limits on behavior and limits on dangerous weapons. If we can do this right, we can augment stability in space and curb the pathways to conflict. We can avoid an arms race and spending money on things we don't need to, and it can help preserve the space environment from debris and make it safer and less expensive for others to operate. So we could also, ideally identify more cooperative models for security, given that space, everyone uses the same part of space. If we do this right, space actors would have less incentive to try to counter anti-satellite weapons with their own and have less incentive to sort of use or lose these technologies. But in the absence of these limits, space actors are increasingly seeking other ways to achieve that. So what might space arms control look like? It could take a number of forms, including legally or politically binding multilateral agreements. It could start with unilateral declarations of what states would or wouldn't do, or what they're willing to talk about or to make transparent about themselves. It could include limits on hardware or limits on behavior, depending on the technology. But to be most effective, it probably has to do both because of the dual use technology issue. One example of a limit on a particularly dangerous technology is constraint on these direct ascent interceptors that I mentioned are similar to missile defense interceptors of the type US, India, and China have tested. This could include limits on the test program so that countries don't have a strongly operationalized system that they can count on. Limits their readiness. You could limit the geographical location of these systems to limit the number of satellites that could be targeted synchronously. You might limit the range of the interceptors launching missiles so they can't reach all of low Earth orbit, or you could ban them entirely. It's possible to carve out exceptions for states' security. There are ways to get going to try to cap the ASAT capability of these systems. And the more countries are invested in this model, the more confidence in compliance is necessary. You could increase the sort of more rigorous and intrusive instruments for compliance. Limiting the testing of missile defense interceptors in an ASAT mode also, of course, has the benefit of cutting out this debris production that can be so dangerous. Another example of sort of behavioral limits rather than a hardware limit, which I just mentioned, that could a behavioral limit that could contribute to confidence building and address a potential source of misunderstanding or miscalculation are those sort of looking at the dual use proximity operations satellites. So carefully negotiated norms that establish how close and under what conditions a satellite may approach another can help establish a confidence about a potential adversary's intentions and provide a way to identify actions that are sort of out of bounds and require more attention. So for that reason, space actors could reserve their energy for solving sort of real problems rather than seeing them where they don't exist, or misinterpreting actions as a deliberate signal or precursor to an attack when they actually are not. Success in adopting discrete and incremental steps like those above, which are not comprehensive instruments, which are just solving specific problems, can also build confidence that the international community of space users can identify common concerns and can find agreed solutions, and that we have mechanisms to do that. And so that we can move on to sort of more comprehensive, longer term, robust sort of ways to manage the space security problem so that we all have a strong, secure, sustainable future in space. And so with that, I'm going to leave the slides and turn to you for discussion.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, I have unmuted myself. I think after doing this for a year, you would think that I would remember, but very often I do not. Thank you very much for that great overview, Laura, in which you put some of the central issues that make space arms control so very problematic. I have a number of questions, but I will also, so let me lead off with a few, and then I'm hoping that the audience will also put in their questions as well. So please use the chat function for any questions. I guess two big questions, Laura, for you. How does the rise of commercial stakeholders either become a useful building block or a potential stumbling block in terms of building space arms control agreements or things? The second question, I think, has to do with the behavioral changes that I think you correctly identified will be important. You also mentioned, how we are deadlocked in terms of multilateralism at the international level. However, 2020 December was a good year if you are looking at what's going on in the General Assembly and in terms of the resolution that's passed about the norms and responsible behaviors in space. Do you, as an expert in this field, feel that might build, it's an important building block, particularly in a world that's returned to great power competition? Is this something that the US can actually sign on to if we want to move forward in terms of building the safe and sustainable future? So those two questions, why don't we open there, and then we will take the other questions as they come.
Great. Well, thank you, Sadia. Those are really good questions. So I've been working on these issues for a while, as I mentioned, and I would say back in the early 2000s, we certainly tried to engage the commercial space sector in these issues and did not have much luck at all. I think, to be frank, they thought that their interests lied sort of wherever the military interests lied, and were not interested in getting out ahead or around of whatever the US government thought, because they were a primary customer of theirs. And that's still largely true. At least, so only speaking in the US, because that's of course what I know best. That's still true. The US military is a big customer, but I do think the character of commercial space has changed. It's dominating space now. I think military haven't done this by mass, which I think is a much better proxy than number for how much mass is in military satellites, but it's sort of around 15%. It certainly does not dominate. And so I think I wonder, and there may be people in the audience who have much better connections to commercial space industry than I do, and whether that's changed because there's certainly so much more money to be made in space, hundreds of millions of dollars, as some people predict, that predictability and security is important to that business model. You don't want to have to operate in an environment which is more risky than necessary. So I would certainly hope that they're friendly to this. Whether they would take the lead, I don't know. But rules of the road, I think so many of the general ones, which are not so security specific, which talk about where, space traffic management, where's your satellite, who's got to get out of the way, who's in charge of knowing where things are and warning about collisions, providing who's, are we going to need a more robust sort of licensing program? I know they prefer a light touch, but eventually, you're going to really need to be able to say who's got the use of these spaces and how do we coordinate that most efficiently and effectively. And so I think a much more organized and rules-based setup is going to be necessary for everybody to be able to make the best use out of space. So I would hope that at least on that piece of it, the commercial space sector would be a powerful positive force. And I would love to hear also that they'd be interested in influencing their governments towards really taking hold of these security issues, which, on a day-to-day, issue, probably they don't think affects them. But, I was hoping to outline the fact that, on a large scale, they can be catastrophically problematic for space operations. So you want to be really careful. Also, because, commercial satellites tend to carry a lot of military traffic, or military, they're leased, the capacity is leased, they're not out of the fray. In a conflict, if one country is trying to deny the other country the use of space-based information or space facilities, under which circumstances they would leave these commercial satellites alone or interfere with them. And that was some of the kind of things we were trying to work out in the legal manual that I had been taking part of, the WUMRA manual. But they need to be paying attention to that. Your second question, I think, was whether we can expect to see some progress now that there's been a little bit of softening up. I think the UK made a proposal in the UN General Assembly, and the US has been feeling more favorable about the UN Conference on Disarmament. I would like to think that that's true, that we're ready to do that. And while I have plenty of things to say about the Space Force, which is the US, conception in the military about the space, I hope one positive thing that might come out of that is sort of a unified voice to say we actually need to deal with this. It's clear that leaving threats to just proliferate without trying to shape that at all is not going to be to our interest. And so you are hearing interest in building norms. One of the challenges is, of course, is that the United States orientation is much more towards informal norms and rules of the road and agreements that are ad hoc or not treaty-based. And certainly the two other big players, China and Russia, have clearly expressed that they're most comfortable negotiating under the auspices of the United Nations. They like that venue there. It's where they feel they're most comfortable, or it's most advantageous to them, and the United States has not wanted to engage there. So whether there's another place for those conversations to happen, at least at the beginning, that might be the case. It certainly may start with these bilateral dialogues, which I have been hearing they're happening between the United States and Russia, and perhaps between the United States and China, I don't know, to start get an idea where they might start, because I don't think there's even a clear sense that the countries think of the problem in the same way, much less the solution. So.
Great.
Yes, sorry, that's a long answer.
No, I think that was wonderful. And just to remind our audience and to let you know, Laura, we had General Armano here for a talk as well. She's from the U.S. Space Force. And one of the things that we were really glad to learn from someone inside the U.S. Space Force is that they are interested in dialogues with Russia and China. So I think that is also a very positive sign. So let me now stop talking and also take questions. Let me take Matt Gabert's question first, and then I'm going to go in order because it directly follows from the issue about private companies. What is the best course of action for the US government to take a lead? And what can private companies do without government help? It's an important, interesting question.
What can private companies do to?
So what is the best course of action for the US government to take the lead? And what can private companies do without government help? In other words, if governments are not part and parcel, what might commercial companies
understood.
do? Yes.
How they might act as independent actors rather than influencing their government. Oh, these are great questions. So there are a number of things that the United States could do. I think where it's most likely to happen is a advancement of a set of norms, and they're likely so that we've had success doing that. They're at the UN COPUOS, they've come up with space sustainability guidelines, and you look at them and wow, I'm sorry if anyone here worked on them, they seem really anodyne and not super inspiring. They're really basic, but it took a lot of negotiation to get there, a lot of effort to conclude those. So I'm not discounting the amount of energy it takes to get norms going, but for the U.S. to come up with what it thinks norms should be, U.S. leadership has been missing in this sense. Sorry, not being coherent. So Russia and China have this preferred treaty that they've been advancing called PPWT, the Prevention and the Placement of Weapons in Space Treaty. And the U.S. has not been interested in it. It has a lot of criticisms about it. And some fair and some I don't think are great criticisms. But what it hasn't done is said, but here's what we think instead. Here's what we would like to see in a sort of a more legally binding type of arrangement. It just has never answered that way. It's sort of glaring. And has not really been active in the norms business either. Much, setting aside sort of treaty-based things, which are certainly hard, sort of norms. So here are the kinds of things we think are important. So it could do that. But I would point to the fact that we had a process that laid out a lot of the rules of the road. It did pretty well. It was it was guided by the European Union, the Space Code of Conduct, which sort of was advanced during the Obama administration and sort of failed to get across the finish line in 2015. A lot of work was done, and those are pretty good rules. They had good stuff in them, a really good basic set of things, and I think people had general agreement. One of the problems reportedly was not so much the substance, but the process, which was a sort of set of, the countries were not really willing to take a received set of instructions from the Europeans and to sign on later. I think rising space powers wanted to be at the table from the beginning. So process does matter. So content, substance and process matter. So I would say that the United States needs to put somebody in charge who's very adept at this. It should not be led by the military. It should be led by the State Department. It should be somebody who really knows what they're doing and knows how to create a process that's inclusive. If it cannot be in the body that's inclusive, which is the UN, then there should be a really hard think about what that venue is that assuages those objections of other countries that you do need to get on board. So that's a sort of a writ large thing. And also, of course, talking to China and Russia early and often about these things to get on the same page about the things that are going to be really challenging, to start those dialogues, which are going to take a while, I think, because they just haven't happened well. So I think, my dream would be the US advancing a great set of treaty recommendations. The more realistic is the US is going to promulgate some norms sort of in the way it did the Artemis Accords, which are like, here's what we think. Would you like to join on? And my hope in the middle is that the US devises some process with partners that brings people to the table to at least make some real progress. And then the question about companies, what they can do in absence of, rather than influencing their own government, I do think a lot of the innovation will come from there. A lot of these rules will probably come through I don't know what in the space industry, what those convening bodies are where space companies come together to discuss things, or if there's an appropriate one, but a set of rules of the road where people know that they exchange information and set their own norms and figure out how to talk to each other. I know that there are commercial companies and some academic institutions that fuse data and send out sort of warnings or provide products you can buy about space situational awareness, but how do you start to institutionalize some of these norms? And my guess, some of these close approach norms are going to be developed by commercial companies as well. So I don't know much about it, and maybe others here do and could tell us.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. This is a question about rocket reusability. And the question is, what are your thoughts on rocket reusability and in relation to space arms control? Specifically thinking about the groundwork laid with SpaceX's Falcon 9 and the eventual goal of full and rapid reusability with Starship, a two-stage to orbit system.
So that's a great question. I personally don't think of it a lot, but where I think it, rather than arms control, but where I think this type of thing might be helpful in terms of space security and stability is this idea of resilience on orbit. So I didn't talk about it too much in my remarks, but one of the challenges, from a military point of view, or probably from a commercial point of view, is what to do is the resilience of your system. So that's really what, like a US military planner might be thinking about. I derive all of this value from my space systems. How do I make sure it doesn't go away? My job is to make sure it doesn't go away. And of course, I've been talking mostly about arms control, which controls the threats piece. Like, how do I make sure that I have as few threats to them as possible? But of course, there's the other piece, which is how do I make sure my system is resilient to any interference? Or if I lose something, how have I designed my system to be redundant, resilient, replaceable, so that I could rapidly launch something if I needed to, replace something that I couldn't replace with something I already have on orbit? How quickly can I replace it? And I think that sort of rapid reusability is important. I think the plunging in launch costs can also sort of play a role both ways. If it's too cheap, then I fear people won't build things reliably and well because they can just replace it. But if it's just cheap enough, you're not so worried about losing something important because you could replace it. So that's the way I would think it would intersect. I haven't thought about it a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a very good and useful question, because I think one of the things, as you were hinting, Laura, this question makes us ask how reusability may affect incentives for space arms control. Does it make the resilience make you more likely to go for arms control, or do you just say, well, no? So I think that's the real
issue. I took care of the problem already.
Exactly. So, okay, so next question I have is, in the context of space arms control, how do you parse the Missile Defense Agency's Next Generation Interceptor NGI program intended for ballistic missile defense?
Okay, well, so that's a good question. For those who don't know about the NGI program, the sole actually current system to defend the United States from intercontinental ballistic missiles, like from North Korea or something, is the ground-based mid-course defense system, which comprises 44 interceptors, mostly in Alaska. There are 4 at Vandenbergs in California. And these are these powerful missile defense interceptors I mentioned, which really look a lot like, space launch vehicles. And they push this kill vehicle into space very quickly to run into an incoming warhead. The NGI, that program has been plagued by failure. It's not been well run. The test record is 50% really, and the tests have been not realistic. So it's 50% under very scripted conditions. So the Pentagon is trying to replace those interceptors with something that's been designed better and works better. So that's what the NGI is. those won't be in place for another 10 years. So the question is, do 44 interceptors or 60 or 100 interceptors, how important is that for space arms control? And that's a great question. The NGI indicates it's sort of a doubling down on this approach. We're going to build them, rather than we admitting this isn't working, we're just going to stop building a homeland missile defense system. It's sort of a doubling down on the approach that we're going to continue to do this. So the question is whether 100 interceptors that can be used to target pretty much any low Earth orbiting satellite are an impediment to space arms control. And my guess is it is. The other, but a larger concern is the another system the U.S. fields called the Aegis, which is mostly based on ships. And currently, those interceptors are less powerful than, they will always be less powerful than these other ones. They can't reach quite as high or have quite as big a lateral reach, but the new interceptor that's being developed and being fielded can reach all of low Earth orbiting satellites. And those are mobile platforms, so you can kind of just move them wherever, underneath whatever satellite orbit you think you want to catch. And those are planned to be fielded in the hundreds. And while, it might be on the edge whether 40, 60, 100 interceptors might interfere, but if you have 300, 400 interceptors that can target, basically taking out all of your adversary's satellites, that has to be dealt with. There's just no way that you can effectively do space arms control without making some kind of way to address these things.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. The next question is, what about the unintended consequences of banning certain dual-use technologies in space and the possibility of limiting advancement? Taking the sticky topic of nuclear propulsion systems as one example.
No, it's a good question. The unintended consequences. Well, I certainly would think that we'd think those all through and make a sensible, risk analysis about that. And I'm not sure I'm prepared to talk about the nuclear propulsion systems right now. Those are certainly of a concern. I think, even bigger concerns are these large proposed nuclear reactors to power, on celestial body bases. Those are also a real challenge. So that's a good question. I'm not sure. So the dual use capabilities I was talking about, missile defense interceptors and close approach satellites, I think can be dealt with without banning outright. So I think there are ways around it. I haven't thought through the nuclear propulsion systems though, so I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
Yeah, maybe this is something you do at MIT, Laura. Help us think through what is possible.
Maybe.
So now I have a question from General Sandra Finnan, who is over at the Pacific Northwest Nuclear Lab here in Pacific Northwest. And General Finnan is asking, what do you think will happen in space if the US government fails to take a leadership role in creating international policy, norms, and treaties? Will someone else emerge as the leader? Will that inhibit US activity in space? How will commercial interests advance in space? And I guess ultimately the question is, will this affect our international standing?
Oh, well, that is such a great question. It is a question. I'd love to hear her answer to this. But I would say, I think I think it's important for the U.S. to lead. Certainly, we currently have the most invested in space, and we want to have a future in space. We are a high-tech country. We'd like to be on the leading edge of technology and shaping those things. We want to shape the norms. I believe we want to shape the norms to the U.S. benefit, but to the global benefit. Space is the patrimony, but space belongs to everybody on Earth, right? And we don't want to have a situation where one country dominates it, certainly. I don't want that to be the United States. I don't want that to be another country. I want to have a really thoughtful regime where everybody gets access to the things that will benefit us. Well, someone else emerge as the leader. So it does seem to me we haven't really seen that, which is interesting. It just seems to be a lack of coordination and in fact, an assumption of the worst of everybody else. So it does take, when you have current, the current situations, you do really need to get at least the big three space powers to agree, US, China, and Russia. And they seem to have a more or less agreed framework, and the United States isn't interested, but they haven't convinced everybody else to go along with them. And you don't see that happening in international fora either. You don't see everybody saying, this is the best idea, let's go for it. You're going to actually really need all three to agree, or else it's going to be this, I feel like not taking action is taking an action, right? Inaction is an action here because everyone assumes the worst of each other, stuff proliferates, no choices are made, and you just end up in a more threatening environment. So like non-action is worse, in my opinion. So I think that's the future if the United States doesn't take some leadership, because I think we could get somewhere if the US really takes this seriously. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And I think there are indications, Laura, as you were pointing out earlier, that there is a softening of approach, thinking about how we can also build norms and rules and responsible behavior that are of interest to the US military as well as commercial stakeholders. So there's some important interests there that are intersecting and really do, I think, point some way for US leadership, or a basis for US leadership to go forward. Okay, I have another question on unintended consequences. We need to redirect an asteroid, but don't have a powerful enough engine to get it to affect its orbit. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay.
I think I was saying, he was asking, what are the unintended consequences?
Yes.
Well, I mean, so for a question like that, the answer to we need to redirect an asteroid, I mean, you get yourself a lot of time to get there by building telescopes to see them farther away. If you do a good job of that, then you don't have to stress yourself on the getting there quickly part if you can detect them farther enough away. And that is something that we know how to do. It's pretty low tech. It's just an investment. I don't think, so I think he was just asking about speed of powerful enough engine to get to it. So yeah, so I don't know enough about that to know what the advantages would be there. I think you often hear an argument that we need to be able to keep nuclear weapons because that's important for redirecting an asteroid. I think that, I don't know the latest research on this, I think, but again, as long as you know far ahead of time, like if you start from the premise, we don't want to prioritize using nuclear weapons for things, then you back that out and you say, the thing that you need to do is make sure you detect these far away and that you give yourself enough time to use something else to solve your problem. So I don't know how that works in this particular technology because I haven't looked at it clearly enough, but I would say that's my reaction is if you decide you don't want to do something, there are usually a workaround.
Yeah. Great. Another question, your very informative talk is focused on kinetic risks to physical space assets. What about non-kinetic forms of interference with space assets, such as software corruption or jamming? Are existing treaties sufficient depth given dependence of the US economy on space communications?
Are existing treaties sufficient depth given dependence?
Are existing treaties, I guess, sufficient? So for example, the constitutional structure of the Outer Space Treaty, for example. So,
yes, well, of course, yes. So the Outer Space Treaty itself is pretty general and doesn't speak to these issues specifically. Although, as you mentioned, there's certainly other international law that applies. Of course, the whole body of international, law of armed conflict and the use of force and all of those things apply in detail. And so there is that question, so I do know some of those are being worked out because I did contribute to some of those efforts, which were trying to, for example, the WUMRA manual, which should be published this year, is the hope, which looks at the body of international laws as applied to military space operations, and asks that question: how do we apply these in this physical environment in the way that the Talon manual looked at cyber warfare, and the Harvard Air and Missile, and the San Remo manual looked at naval warfare. So so that is a question whether it has a lot of depth to it, right? So there probably the first line of attack will be cyber attacks, software attacks, corruption. That seems, my guess, easier, less attributable. You don't always know if it's effective, though. It depends what you're trying to do, but that certainly, I think, is in the toolkit, and would. I have no expertise, no specific expertise there, so the physical domain might be easier to limit, but I don't know the answer to that. But of course, there's electronic warfare, which has a long history, not just against satellites, against all kinds of things. And I think that that's a pretty well worked out set of legal principles. Then there are questions about, another one of those questions is like laser attack on satellites. So it's not kinetic in that you're moving a mass into something else, but there's the question: can you interfere with the satellite using lasers, from the ground, for example? So satellites that have imaging sensors, you can try to interfere with them. If you're trying to have somebody not look at your ground area, you can equip it with a laser that shines on that sensor that makes it have to close its shutter or be, damaged. That's, I think, a pretty low tech kind of thing, and it's a pretty low effect kind of thing, right? You can't affect a large region using that technology. So it doesn't come up quite to the same level when I'm talking about arms control, in the same way that ground-based jammers, of GPS signals don't. It's not quite the same thing. When you talk about GPS jamming, people often lump that in with space arms control, but usually GPS jamming is a local jamming of local receivers. So it never goes anywhere near space. It's just you're interfering with the signal someone's receiving from space by being louder than it. That's usually the jamming strategy, the tactical strategy, rather than trying to interfere with the satellite itself. So a lot of these will be harder to capture in a sort of arms control thing. I think you would really have to separate those types of things out, to be honest. It's one of the things that makes it a little more complicated is a hacking attack on a ground station, space security, probably not.
Thank you very much, Laura. Amy, I think we are at time right now. Thank you so much for sharing your reflections on the past, present, and hopefully future of space arms control. And thank you for joining us at UW. It's a great pleasure to have us with you, and I hope you'll come back again as you begin to think about space and nuclear nexus going forward. Thank you so much for having
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.